Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello and welcome back to another exciting edition of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Vaughn Smith, and this is our Cisco Cloud Fundamentals series. And in this episode, we're going to take a look at our cloud service models, comparing and contrasting our service providers and our cloud providers. And here to help us is Mr. Ronnie Wong. How are you?
I am doing well, Vaughn. Thank you again for joining me as we continue on in our series together, taking a look, of course, at the idea of the way that Cisco wants to present cloud fundamentals. And we're taking a brief break from the NIST definition because I could see Vaughn's eyes starting to glaze over as I started heading into one more. Like, are you joking? No, we're still going to go over it, but we're going to take a little bit of a pause here because now that I've introduced the idea of the term cloud, and the characteristics behind the cloud, and we've talked about this idea in detail in terms of those things, we now also need to talk about another term here and how we get access to something, which of course is the idea of a service provider and the idea of a cloud provider. So sometimes people will mistakenly confuse these two. They're not really super far apart, but they are far apart enough that Cisco calls it out on the exam. And so Vaughn, since they actually call this out as far as the exam objectives go, it means we do have to be able to compare and contrast them a bit so that we understand what we're talking about when we start talking about the idea of a service provider and is a cloud provider really so different as well, okay? So that is what we're actually going to be taking a look at as we get started here, okay? So when it comes down to it, let's make sure that we understand what our definition is of a service provider too, okay? So Vaughn, when it comes down to the idea of a service provider, most of us pretty much kind of only deal with one service provider that we can think of just right off the bat. And especially if you're sitting at home, you probably have actually dealt with it and you didn't even realize it, which is our internet service provider, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's pretty much the one that we are familiar with. Now, Vaughn, we have to ask the question. I know I keep saying these are questions you should ask, but I think it comes naturally that if you're learning about this, like, well, the question is, Vaughn, why can you not connect directly to the internet yourself without using a service provider, an internet service provider? That's the kind of question that we have to kind of think about for a moment, okay? And there's actually kind of a technical reason behind this, but overall, though, there's a couple of things that we can talk about that help us out, okay? So, Vaughn, if you wanted to be able to connect directly to the internet, well, you can't by yourself, okay? And the reason why is because, one, you don't have all the equipment necessary to be able to connect to the backbone of the internet, okay? So you're not allowed to in that sense. One, okay, or you, I shouldn't say you're not allowed to. You don't have the capabilities because even though your modem connects you into a service provider's network, that's not directly connected to the internet. That's connected to their network, and then you're doing something.
Yeah, because I was just thinking, I mean, I wouldn't know how to do it.
Wouldn't know how?
I wanted to say, I don't even think I'm able to. It's just like little old me connecting to the internet backbone.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of specific, like people that can access that and then provide that service to me. So I don't have the means to.
Right. So the means in either the idea of the technical nature of how the heck do we actually connect to it, and secondly, do I actually have the capability to do so in terms of cost or means to do so of the equipment? So both you and I are in the same boat, Vaughn, as we actually get started here. And the reason why we have to know that is when we start talking about the idea of a service provider, if we break that term down, right, the service provider itself, it kind of explains itself that there is some particular vendor that's out there that says, look, I can connect to the internet because one, I have all the equipment to do so, okay? Two, we have the technical capabilities to ensure that when you put stuff on our network, we can get it out onto the internet as well, okay? And when they do something like that, they're not only doing it for their benefit, but what they do is they come to you and me, Vaughn, and say, hey, for a charge, we will give you also the access that we've already set up in the background. So, Vaughn, you don't have to understand the technicalities of something like BGP, okay? You don't have to understand the idea here of all of the different devices that you have to be able to connect through before you can get your data onto the internet backbone, okay? They just kind of, at least in my house, and I'm assuming yours, regardless of what type of connection you have, you essentially have either a cable modem, satellite modem, DSL modem, wireless modem, whatever you want to call it, right? you essentially have those, and that is what connects you into their network, okay? But from their network, they actually provide the connection out to the internet in that sense, okay? So once we actually have something like that, we realize something, that it's a provider that says, if you'll do that, we'll provide for you this piece of equipment that will then allow you to connect, and then you are off and you are ready to go. So it's usually a particular solution that the service provider gives us or provides for us of something that we really can't accomplish on our own, okay? So at least for most of us, the internet service provider is kind of the big one, okay? So regardless of whether it's the technical details behind how to connect, or whether it's because I don't have the equipment or whatever it is, okay? Instead, what can happen is that you and I, as an entity of some sort, okay, or a business as an entity, says, hey, we'll actually make that connection by going to a service provider that says they already know how to do this. And what then we can request is how fast or how much bandwidth we want to be able to use and how much money we're willing to pay to be able to do this. So that's what a service provider does for us when we start to take a look, okay? Now, Vaughn, just because I mentioned the idea of just the internet service provider, that's pretty much what I'm going to say 90% of people think about when we think about the idea of a service provider, okay? So, Vaughn, have you thought about any other service providers besides the internet service provider itself? Have you actually ever thought, oh, yeah, I know about all these other service providers out there?
Well, since you have it right here in these notes right here for me, that I can see that they have a couple other ones.
Well, there are other ones, but you and I probably just, if on a regular day-to-day basis, the internet service provider is probably the only one I've ever really at least thought about as an individual customer, right? As a single person. I don't tend to think about all these other ones that you're talking about here.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of like the gateway into everything. Because, I mean, you could think about things like Dropbox or Google Drive, you know, because I'm looking here at like storage service, but if you don't have the internet, then you don't really have the ability to go to storage. So
Right.
it's kind of like the point of entry for a lot of things in a regular consumer type of mind frame.
Right. Yeah. And I think that you actually make a good point there. It is kind of the beginning of just about every other service provider we're going to talk about, but there are some different ones. And let's take a look at my screen here. And this will help us out if I can actually get it to zoom in the way that I need to, and I can get access to the tool. So, Vaughn, one of the things, of course, that Cisco is always good about doing as far as the exam goes is to try and see if you can actually kind of be able to define, okay, what some of these particular providers are or something like that. And they might not provide it in a list like this, but it's essentially a search is what we have to do, okay? We're going to connect the actual service provider with the characteristics of that service provider. Now, Vaughn, I have not done the greatest job in the world, but all of these are essentially mixed up over on the right-hand side, okay? So we're going to talk about each one of these briefly so that we can understand what is going to happen and what we actually do here. So I'm just going to match these things up for us to make sure that we understand what it is that we have to be able to understand about these service providers. Now, since we started with the internet service provider here, okay, Vaughn, okay? So what I'm actually taking, oh, look, there it is, internet service provider. I want to link that up to one of these characteristics over here. And I already see it right there. Provides, internet and DNS registration. That for me, I'll go, hey, is that exactly what a service provider does? Yes, okay. When I connect into a service provider, I don't set up my own DNS server. Vaughn, at home, did you actually have a DNS server set up at your own house?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, why not? Everybody does, right? Yeah. Not really. Most of us don't do that. But yeah, usually it's the internet service provider that provides that for us. So, Vaughn, I'm going to take the first one here, and then I'll let you actually match up the... No, I'm not going to do that. I was joking here.
Oh,
but,
I can do it. Come on.
All right.
With your help.
Yeah. We'll go ahead and just match that one up. So, because that's the easiest one. That's the one that we all think about when we first start to actually take a look at this. But notice some of the other ones that are out there. So, Vaughn, now that we're connected to the internet, like what you were saying, okay, there's also another type of connection that we can have that's like the internet, but not exactly the same thing here, which is actually going to another type of network, not a data network, but more of a voice network as well. And oh, look at that, telecom service provider here.
I was going to say provides telephony, data, lease, and line between customer and service provider.
Yeah, if you remember the earliest days of the internet when you had dial-up modems, we weren't really going over a dedicated network that is just a data network for us. We went over telephone lines into our ISP, and then once we got onto our ISP's network, then it actually brought us out to the internet. So a telecom provider is actually one of the things that you do see, okay? So it could provide telephony, but most of the time we're still doing this for internet access of some sort, right? The data leased line is probably the one that a lot of businesses still rely on, that gives dedicated access, especially for something like your VoIP lines and stuff like that. It is out there. It is available to us to think about. Okay, so that's another one that we can actually kind of make sure that we can see that. All right, so let's take a look at another one here. So Vaughn, I'm going to actually move up the list because it actually looks like the terms are really helping me out here. Okay, storage service provider. Oh, look. Provides computer storage. So you can see I didn't really make it super difficult, but these are terms that you should look up if you haven't before and realize this as well. Okay. Now there are some acronyms that are also associated with these terms. As like that's just too much to actually look at on the screen at the same time. But but these are things that you can look up and you'll see the little acronyms inside of the parentheses as you get some. Okay. All right. So I see Vaughn staring very intently. Vaughn, have you matched up another one that you think?
Well, some of these are a little weird, I would say.
Yeah, they are,
so the
they?
network service provider, that provides data backbone network?
That is really good. Yes, it is.
Because it says network, so I figured those match.
Yeah, no, that's actually a great one for us, right? You do whatever you can do as far as the exam goes to make sure that you can kind of figure it out here. But I gave you my definitions, so I can't tell you that these are Cisco's exact definitions. But you, again, by studying, right, Vaughn, studying, looking up, writing down your definitions so you understand what they are is going to help you to match this up a little bit better, okay, as well. All right, so Vaughn looks like that she is actually maybe glommed onto another one here. All right.
I would say application server provider would own, operates, and maintains software that customer needs.
Hey, you are good.
Software,
there you go.
Application,
yeah,
okay.
Excellent. All right. So Vaughn is actually hitting just about every one of these so far. So, all right. So now we only have computer service provider, data center service provider, managed service provider. Vaughn, you're actually doing very good here.
Okay.
All right.
Well, I'm going to say managed service provider would do the remotely controls infrastructure.
You are good.
All
Once
right.
again, Vaughn has actually hit this. The managed service provider or MSP, these are actually the guys that come out and do exactly this way. You outsource your IT department. Managed service providers are the ones that really do this for you. So there are plenty of companies out there that allow you to be able to see this. So this is a very growing space. The reason why is because more and more of these guys, they're actually hiring more people like me. Say, look, I know you can manage a single network, but what if you can manage 3 of them in the same time and get paid very well for it? I'd love to be able to do something like that. That's essentially what they're saying. And if you like that type of work, this is the type of thing for you. All right, Vaughn, the good thing is that means we are down to what?
Process elimination.
Process of elimination.
Computer service provider is probably going to provide and support a complete computer system.
Excellent. Good job, Vaughn. So, Vaughn, you have absolutely aced this, and hopefully you can recognize that the last one then would have to be
provides hosting and co-location.
Co-location, okay? So for those that have not heard about the idea of co-location, you might have, you might not have. This is instead where you host a part of your infrastructure somewhere else. So for example, Vaughn, right here for our internet service provider, who is Grucom, which is Gainesville Regional Utilities, they're a great company. They have a co-location facility. And that means if I don't want to store my infrastructure here on site, I can take a portion of it, maybe for something like disaster recovery, and store it at their site, and they provide that connection for us. Again, another charge that they can do. But this is actually kind of a neat thing if you want to. And they have racks in the back, and you can actually provide either as little or as much equipment as you want to, and they'll host it right there for you. And again, once again, another fee that you have. Okay. So Vaughn, these are kind of the most basic of the different service providers that are out there. And sometimes you hear them called specialized service providers. And the reason why that's important, your company may not just need an internet service provider. We know at least minimally, Vaughn, we do. Okay. At least minimally, we need an internet service provider to be able to get access to a lot of these other ones out there, just like what you're mentioning. But on the whole here, okay, that's what we generally think of in terms of just regular traditional types of service providers that are out there. Now, just when I say that though, Vaughn, okay, let's talk about the idea of cloud providers here just briefly as well. Now, this one I did not make a matching because it was such a big list here. And we're actually just going to, I'm not going to go review too much of this, but just as a simple example, right? You're going to see all this and more. Now, the great thing is, even though this is kind of a list of the types of cloud providers that are out there, it's kind of the difference here. Vaughn, do you see a kind of theme running through the column on the left in terms of repeating words or anything like that?
You mean as a service?
As a service, okay. And that, once again, tells you what? Cloud providers are not about what? Here's the technology you're really buying into as far as you understanding the basics here, but saying what? We're providing you what? The service, okay? So servers as a service, storage as a service. We're providing that to you as a service. So it's all about the way that you access this is what they're talking about.
Well, I mean, this is what a lot of our normal stuff is going to. When I mean normal stuff, like Adobe software, I mean, that's something that I have used for many, many years, like application as a service, right? I mean, like I have a subscription that I pay Adobe to use and install Photoshop and InDesign. And I mean, you can even go with that with Office and all of these different things. Everything's a SaaS, DaaS, you know, all these different things that you pay a specific fee and you're able to get this service.
So unlike the idea of what we just looked at in the service provider, which can just charge you a monthly fee for everything, right? So your internet service bill, I'm assuming they charge you monthly or yearly or 6 months or whatever it is.
They charge me, that's for sure.
But these, it's not so much. It goes back to that cloud definition we were talking about, that it's like a pay-as-you-go, right? So here, for example, like what you're talking about, the application as a service, well, you pay for that usually on a month-by-month basis. So like right here at IT Pro TV, we use Office 365. Well, every single license we pay for is done on a monthly basis, right? You sign a contract for a year, but you get paid you pay it by the month. So it does actually allow you to do that, to be able to do some of the things here. So it's important that you understand kind of the difference here. And it's because of those characteristics that we were just talking about, that idea of the elasticity and everything else that we were mentioning, resource pooling, you name it, all that actually fits underneath this. Whereas in the other service provider, it doesn't have to be that. They can just go, well, Vaughn, you paid for your internet service. I don't care if you only used it for 2 days this past month, or if you used it every single day this past month, you're going to pay that fee.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of in like the collective consciousness of today's, society. I mean, you talk about the Netflix and the Hulu and IT Pro TV. These are all different things that these companies are providing this as a service for you to go ahead and be able to access at different levels and different price points and different ways that you want to be able to pick and choose what you need.
There's no doubt that all of that's actually important, but just make sure that you understand that there is a slight difference when it comes down to the difference between service providers and cloud providers. But they all share some type of common characteristic here, Vaughn, when it comes down to it. And so what do we actually have when we start taking a look at the idea of service providers and some of the more common characteristics to actually take a look at, okay? So when it comes down to common characteristics, usually when we start dealing with this aspect, we're actually talking about the relationship between the service provider and the customer itself. Now, the reason why I want to mention that is that it's normally not just a standard package of anything, okay? So Vaughn, even though Vaughn might have internet service that gives her a gigabit internet, okay? Well, where I am, it's not going to be a gigabit internet. And as far as my house goes, it's just not going to do that. So it can be customized, and it can even be on a per customer basis of how much you actually get if you actually need it to. So not everything is going to be the same. It might be where you go, hey, I want unlimited internet, or you can actually say, no, I only need 150 gigs or 50 gigs, whatever it might be. So that agreement between the customer and that provider is actually going to be key. The other part is that time limitation that we have as well. So it's not forever. It's as long as you pay for it, but they also tell you what the terms are going to be. Is this actually guaranteed for the entire term of the service, or is it guaranteed for a little bit, or is it guaranteed for the first 3 months like some places have when you start doing this? What is the level that's actually going to be, what is it going to cost you essentially? What's the agreed compensation that you have? And the most important characteristic, and I hinted to Vaughn at this as well, Vaughn, when we start talking about the idea of providing a service, okay, what is probably the most important characteristic when somebody says, I'm going to provide this service?
You need a service level agreement.
Service level agreement, an SLA, right? And
yes.
Vaughn has been studying the idea of SLAs here. Okay?
Yes, I am deep into my ITIL 4 foundations.
There you go.
And so all of this, I'm like, oh, I'm very familiar with this and the value co-creation and all these definitions. So yeah, it's all studying this and the slight definition, like you said, service providers, cloud providers. I'm like, Yeah, I've been in this for a while.
There you go. Yeah. So all that's actually very important for us as we start to take a look. So the SLA, right, for us is actually something that's very important. It is that agreement that we're talking about that we have to understand that normally happens between every type of service provider that there is, okay? Now, we also have to understand the purpose of the SLA, which can be easily mistaken at times here. And so let me just go ahead and we're going to just bring up my screen here just for a moment. And I'm just going to type in just a couple of words to help us out as we get through this, okay? So purpose, if I can type in purpose. Purpose of SLA, okay? Now, everybody will tell you a different definition, tell you what it's all about here. And remember that between vendors and between different companies, you may hear it slightly different, but they all tend to kind of really point at the same thing, okay? So let's talk about this idea of what we mean in terms of what Cisco is talking about here, okay? The purpose of the service level agreement, okay, is to make sure that we set up what we call the relationship expectation, okay, in regards to either the maintenance of the service itself, the payments that are made, usually all of that as well, compliance, and also something that we call force majeure. Now, I normally don't like to use those types of words here, okay, but that's essentially it, okay? So when we talk about here, I'm going to type in that word, force majeure, if I can actually spell it right, okay? Force majeure. I might have misspelled that, but I think it's actually right here, okay? Now, the reason why I actually want to talk about that particular term too, okay, is we need to make sure that from the very beginning, okay, as we start to actually enter an agreement between the actual service provider and the customer relationship, that the expectation itself, so set the relationship expectation, okay, here, essentially saying, here's what we agree to do, okay, is what they actually do, okay? But there's times, though, that it doesn't matter what's been agreed upon, Vaughn. There are things in which they have to actually implement this in, especially on a technical agreement here, that here's what we do in case a force majeure happens, okay? And a force majeure essentially is the unexpected, okay, situation that may prevent the service provider from actually fulfilling his contract.
Yes, and the Google definition has unforeseeable circumstances that prevent someone from fulfilling a contract.
Oh, look at that.
Basically what you just said.
Yeah, it's kind of neat, right? That sometimes that, you know, these, like force majeure is a standardized definition just about here. So I kind of reworded it just a little bit because that's the way my mind works. But overall, though, that can happen, right? So let's kind of give an example here, okay? So Vaughn, here it is. I'm working at a service provider, and even though everything should be okay, my building catches on fire, okay? Well, that means what? I can't provide that service. So even in a service level agreement, that might be something that I have to be able to make sure that's in there. I'd hate for my customers to sit there and go, I demand you do this. My entire infrastructure is burned down. What can I do? Okay. Well, you should have thought about that before I entered it. You're right. But if it didn't happen, that's where you actually have these types of agreements and you draw them actually up here. Essentially, the service level agreement, even though it's not the actual contract itself, it's usually part of the contract that you have to be, worry or, kind of make sure that you understand here, okay? So that sets that reasonable expectation between that customer and the provider.
Yeah, and I totally talk about incidences, like the unforeseeable things that, like, hey, if it's down, what's the expected level of things that you expect that we'll be able to get it back up and running and all that kind of fun stuff. And
you hope that nothing ever happens to the point where it can't be, So, like the idea that, what is it? The earthquake happens and swallows up the entire city. Well, you can't do that. Or, but sometimes you got to kind of realize that, yes, a service level agreement is pretty much key here. Now, in the realm, especially in what Cisco's talking about, there's also 4 different types of SLAs that we have to actually think about. So we're not going to actually, kind of type out everything here. But the first one is about performance, like what you said here, okay? The very fact is there has to be an agreed level of performance that we have to actually have here, okay? So what's the number of operations, the amount of available capacity guaranteed that will actually happen during the period of service? Now, this can be done in many different ways. We can actually say this about the idea of bandwidth with an internet service provider. If they say they're going to provide for us this much bandwidth, well, they have to actually say, here's the performance level you should see. It shouldn't be kind of vague at that point. It should be that they can do it or they can't do it, okay? So that's what you do in terms of expected performance here. Now, that also means something that's actually quite neat, Vaughn, that if they are willing for me to sign a contract and they say that they can do this, okay, it's probably spelled out in legalese, which means you have to be careful in terms of what that means here, because it could be where they say, look, we're responsible for this, but we're not responsible for any of your in-house wiring. So it could be that your in-house wiring isn't doing what it needs to, so they're not going to be responsible for something like that, okay? Also, of course, uptime. Okay, that's another one. Guaranteed measurable amount of time provided that the service has to work correctly, okay?
Would this be kind of something like availability?
Yep, availability, same thing.
It's working, it's available to you, it's what we are providing you. It's going to be running all the time. Agreed upon.
Agreed upon.
If it's 24 hours, it's 24 hours.
Yep. Or if it's only 9 to 5, then it's 9 to 5.
As long as we agree.
As long as we agree.
On this, agreement.
Yep. The idea of mean time to recovery is something that Vaughn was talking about here, that if something were to happen, what is the agreed upon time that things should be restored? And this is actually very big for everybody, right? The very fact is, when you talk about that mean time to recovery, it's usually the average time it takes for that service to be restored if something happens to the service as well. So MTTR, mean time to recovery. And then, of course, there's one more here that we want to make sure it's for. Yep, customer data management. Management, if I can spell that thing out, okay? So customer data management essentially tells us how do we avoid the loss of data, and how do I spell management correctly? That way instead, okay? So this is actually very important for us as well. The very fact is, how long will the customer's data be available, okay, even after the SLA is completed? Because what we don't want, right? So Vaughn, let's say that you store everything up into Dropbox, okay? And then you go, all right, so my year's contract is up. I can't afford Dropbox anymore, but you didn't get the time to actually download all your data again. So Vaughn, is it actually something that needs to actually be talked about? That they say on the very last date of our agreement, if it's there, it's gone. Well, that's pretty hefty. You know, that's a really strict type of service level agreement that anybody would agree to. But usually, though, it normally is going to actually be a specified period of time, as an example, that your data is going to be available even after the service level agreement is done as well, okay? Sometimes you also have to think about, of course, deletion policies as well as confidentiality. All that is about that.
I was thinking more of like the IT security. I'm, again, going back to ITIL, but they kind of talk about the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and
availability.
Availability,
yep.
Yes, that one.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's the same thing here, okay? Now, Vaughn, when it comes down to the purpose of the SLA, if you think about it, it really means this particular idea, the way that I actually thought about it at the end when I was writing this. You're married for a period of time, okay? For better or for worse. If you agreed upon it, that's what it's going to be. So whatever you agreed upon for performance, for uptime, for mean time to recovery, for your customer data, your customer data management, if it's in your favor, fine. If it's not, it's spelled out in the service level agreement. And that's what everybody should point to when there is some type of dispute, to be able to do something like this as well, okay?
Yeah.
So we have just a couple of minutes left here, but let's go ahead and make sure that we understand, okay? So now that we understand that there are differences between the service level agreement, or the service level service providers, the service providers and the cloud providers, okay? Are there actually anything that's really different about them, okay? Because we all talked about them essentially as providing some type of service, to us and what we need to do. But essentially, the cloud probably has to rely on what the service level providers do. They have to provide some type of infrastructure that's actually there. So usually, cloud can actually encompass anything that the actual service provider does. For example, Dropbox is kind of a big one, right? Okay, so Dropbox, they provide storage as a service, essentially, is what they do. But they may actually depend on something like AWS to do so. Okay, so I think I said that backward then. So I should say that the cloud provider actually provides infrastructure for the service provider in something like that, okay? Also, of course, for the provisioning of things as well, okay? The cloud actually gives us that ability to do so according to what we learned about in the 5 characteristics. Regular service providers, they don't have to actually follow those 5 characteristics to be defined as a cloud. They don't have to follow the idea of on-demand, servicing or rapid elasticity. They can take all the time they want to, but cloud is different. So make sure you understand those 5 essential elements as well, okay? So essentially what it comes down to, as far as differences go, it's really about the dynamic differences between what a standard service level provider or standard service provider can do versus the elasticity or the dynamicism of the idea of the cloud provider as well. Okay, cloud you can easily provision, easily deprovision. Service provider, you may have to actually finish the service level agreement and the time before you can actually do something. So that's really kind of the big difference. But overall, though, they both provide a service for us, and it's both something that's going to be tested on an exam. So make sure you pay attention on these things too. All right, Vaughn, well, this is a great place for us to go and end this episode as well, because there is more to come.
All right, well, I'm excited about that. But we're going to go ahead, like you said, let's just go ahead and wrap it up and sign off for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Vaughn Smith.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
We will see you soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.